We have been conditioned to believe that experience makes people more certain, that the longer someone lives, the easier it becomes to understand what works and what doesn't, what makes people happy, what makes relationships last, and what kind of life is worth building. And sometimes experience does exactly that, but not always. Sometimes it changes people in a stranger way. Sometimes the people who have lived through the most seem the least interested in speaking with certainty. They hesitate longer, become slower to reach conclusions, as if life began arguing with their certainty. None of us begin life knowing very much. We learn by watching, by experimenting, by making mistakes, by discovering what works and what doesn't. And little by little, experience begins assembling a picture of reality, a picture of how people behave, how relationships work, what success looks like. And that's a useful thing, because without those lessons, we wouldn't be able to navigate the world at all. But sometimes experience doesn't just give us information, it gives us confidence. And over time, the lessons we've learned stop feeling like interpretations. They start feeling like facts. Not because we're arrogant, but because they've worked often enough to earn our trust. A person works hard and sees results, and begins to believe effort is the answer. Someone grows up without freedom, and begins to believe freedom is the answer. Someone experiences love, and becomes convinced that love is enough. And for a while, those answers seem to explain everything. But the thing about experience, it never arrives all at once. Life keeps going. New situations appear, new contradictions emerge, and sooner or later, most people encounter something their existing picture wasn't built to explain. A relationship that doesn't behave the way they expected. A success that doesn't feel the way they imagined. A sacrifice that doesn't produce the outcome it promised. An answer that worked perfectly until it didn't. And that's usually where the first crack appears, because reality turned out to be larger than the answer itself. But experience doesn't only provide answers, it also tests them over and over again. And after enough encounters with reality, something begins to change. Maybe experience doesn't make people more certain. Maybe it simply gives reality more opportunities to disagree with them. Most people imagine wisdom as accumulation, as if we spend our lives gathering better answers, learning more, understanding more, becoming more certain about how the world works. And sometimes that's true, but for many people, the process feels almost backwards, because some of the most important things we learn aren't discoveries, they're eliminations. Reality quietly removing explanations that no longer fit. A person spends years believing that happiness begins on the other side of financial security, until they meet people who have everything they once wanted and are still searching for something more. Someone spends years believing that love can overcome anything, until they encounter two people who genuinely care for each other and still cannot build a life together. Someone spends years chasing freedom, convinced that happiness is simply a matter of living on their own terms, only to discover that every choice comes attached to a different set of responsibilities. And little by little, the answers stop feeling as complete as they once did, because experience doesn't always make us wiser by revealing what is true. Sometimes it makes us wiser by repeatedly exposing what isn't. And after enough eliminations, something begins to change. If you're finding something familiar in these observations, consider subscribing. There are many more conversations like this waiting here. I'd love to have you here for the next one. Being wrong about an idea is one thing. Being wrong about yourself is something else entirely, because ideas live in our heads. But the way we understand ourselves quietly shapes more than we realize. The choices we make, the people we admire, the people we judge, and the stories we build around all of it, which is why some of life's most unsettling moments are the ones that force us to reconsider that understanding. A child spends years believing they understand their parents, their fears, their rules, their frustrations, only to find themselves standing in a similar position years later, suddenly seeing something they couldn't see before. The same thing happens with our emotions. We imagine love and hate as opposites, as if one replaces the other. until life introduces us to situations where both seem to exist in the same place, sometimes at the same time. And little by little, the picture begins to change again. Not because we discover who we are, but because we discover we're more complicated than we thought. And once you've seen enough of your own contradictions, other people become harder to simplify, harder to reduce to a single motive, a single mistake, a single explanation. Because you've already discovered that you're more complicated than that, and they probably are too. One of the stranger things that happens during this process is that a person can become less certain without becoming directionless. In fact, sometimes the opposite happens. The answers become less clear, but the priorities become clearer. A person may spend years changing their mind about what success means, whether it looks like wealth, achievement, freedom, recognition, or something else entirely. Yet feel more certain than ever about the importance of effort. They may become less certain about relationships, and more certain about kindness, less certain about how life should unfold, and more certain about the kind of person they want to be while living it. Because after enough experience, the questions begin to change. We stop asking, "What is the answer?" and start asking, "What matters?" Life has a way of testing our conclusions, again and again. Yet some values survive those tests, not because they're easy, not because life always rewards them, but because they continue to feel worth holding on to. That's why some of the people who hesitate the longest aren't necessarily confused. They know what matters to them. They're simply less convinced that every situation can be reduced to a simple answer. From the outside, this change can be difficult to see. It doesn't look like a revelation or a breakthrough or even wisdom. Most of the time, it just looks like hesitation, a longer pause before speaking, a little less urgency to prove a point, a little less confidence in first impressions. And because of that, it can easily be mistaken for uncertainty. But from the inside, the experience often feels very different. The emotions still arrive. The frustration, the disappointment, the anger, the unfairness of certain situations. None of that disappears. The difference is that experience has a way of inserting a pause between the feeling and the reaction. A younger version of us often believes that every emotion deserves an immediate response. But after enough encounters with reality, something begins to slow down. Not because we stop caring, but because we've learned that not every battle changes the outcome. Not every argument produces understanding, and not every reaction improves the situation. Sometimes it makes it worse. Sometimes it costs more than it gives back. So the pause begins to grow. Not a pause of confusion, a pause of consideration, a moment spent weighing the cost of a reaction before surrendering to it. Maybe that's why some of the people who have lived through the most often sound the least certain, not because they've run out of opinions, but because they've learned the difference between having an answer and trusting it completely. For a long time, we assume that experience is supposed to settle the questions. That if we live long enough, pay enough attention, make enough mistakes, the uncertainty will eventually disappear. But maybe that was never the promise. Maybe the value of experience isn't that it removes the questions. Maybe it's that it changes the way we carry them. Because there is a difference between needing an answer and being willing to live with one that is incomplete. And perhaps that's what begins to happen after enough years. Not certainty, not confusion, something in between. A quiet acceptance that some things are larger than our explanations for them, and that our understanding was never meant to be finished, only refined, again and again, for as long as we're paying attention.